In this video, we're going to continue looking at classes. Mostly what I'm going to do is kind of flesh out using tools and concepts that we have already learned. But there will be a few new things here and there, so it's certainly worth a watch. Particularly, this lecture does help with, I don't remember which one, but one of your problems in your homework assignment. So as a reminder, we've created a new data class called chapter. The data class has chapter number, title, first page, number of pages. Number of pages defaults, so you don't have to pass it in. It'll default to one page if you don't give it a value. We have a computed property called last page, a very typical use of a computed property, where we define a get procedure and it returns a computed value. So it takes properties that we've set and then uses that to compute this property's value. And then we did an override on toString. Data class created a nice toString for us, but I wanted something that looked a little bit different, so we went ahead and created an override. And if I run this right now, we create 3 chapter objects, and when I call println on 3, I get this nice format. Okay, so next up, I want to create a book object that will hold our chapters. So we'll create this as just a regular class. And I can just say class, well, don't need parentheses yet, class book, and then here's the body. So before I start writing code, I got to think about what do I want book to be. And I strongly suggest that anytime you're writing any code of any complexity, before you just start writing code, take some time to think out what is that you want to build, what are the objects that you need, what are the properties, what are their methods. I personally, when I do this, I tend to just get out a piece of paper or at least something to write on. And then I do kind of a pseudo UML style diagrams that really let me visualize and think about what I want and how they're all going to work together. This one's pretty easy. What do we need? So what's a book have? Well, book has a title, and book has an author. And what else is the book? Well, there's a lot of other properties, but let's just leave it at that. Title and an author. Then what else does a book have? Well, it has chapters, right? And the idea is that we're going to create a bunch of chapters and add them to this book. So we need to store them someplace, right? We need to have a list of all the chapters in the book. And I think that's enough for property. So let's think about what methods we have. Well, I need to be able to add a chapter, right? And I need to be able to get a chapter. And I think that's, well, actually, you know what? We're going to create a toString so that we can see our work as we're creating it. And I think I might have mentioned this already, but I'm a big fan of overriding toString on classes because I found it to be very, very useful in debugging. That if I've just got a nice string output that gives me whatever information is relevant to the debugging, it usually speeds things up for me. So we'll go ahead and do that here. So up here now I got to think about, so I got my properties, right? Title, author, chapters. So now I got to think about when I instantiate a book, what data would we pass in? Well, let's take a look at the first 2. Chapters we're going to look at in a second. That's a little bit more complicated. But the first 2, these are what? They're strings, title and author. And a book, when you create a book, and let's say that maybe when we create the book's not finished yet. We're using this somehow to track books in progress. So when the book gets created, we might not have any chapters yet, and we might not even have a title yet, but we certainly have an author. We know who's writing the book. So let's say that's our business case. So up here then, I would use author as my first parameter, or my first property, and we're going to say authors don't change. Now, in real life, maybe they could, but we're going to say they don't. So we'll do val author, and it is a property that is of type string. The next one that we had is we have a title. And for a title, we're going to make var because titles, I think, can change and probably do change pretty often. So we'll say var title. But its data type is going to be an optional string. This comes up a lot. You've got to think about when you're creating your object, think about all your properties, and could this property, would it be appropriate for it to have a null? And in this case, I'm saying that when I create a new book, that the book may not have a title yet. So in which case I want to be able to set it to null. And I'm making it a var because it's not static. Once you create a book class, since I'm making val part of the constructor and it's a non-optional string, that means you have to give it a value. And because it's a value, you can never change it. So just by looking at this, you know a lot about this object, that when you create a book, you've got an author, the author's set in stone, can't change it. Title, however, right now, it's optional, so you can change it. You could set it back to null, back and forth, change as much as you want. Could have a value, could not have a value. And then the last one that we need is chapters. So what is chapters going to be? Well, we have more than one chapter. So once we need to keep a group of things, we have to start thinking, you may immediately start thinking about arrays, but in most object-oriented languages, what I really want you to think about are collections. And that comes up much, much more common. And that's what I'm going to use for this. I'm going to introduce what I think is probably the most common collection that you'll use, and it's called an array list. So over here, so it's set up, and the data type is actually array list. And then when you declare an array list as a data type, in greater than, less than signs, you have to say the data type. So in this case, we're going to create an array list, and its data type, or the type of object that this array list can hold, is a chapter. Hopefully that makes sense. So now I've got my three things created. And so now I want to start thinking about how would somebody create this, right? When they go to instantiate a new book object, what would my needs be? And since I'm making all this up, my needs can be whatever I want, but I'm going to pick what I think are some of the more appropriate ones. So first I'll start off with title. I've already said that I think that when you create books, this could be null, and a lot of times when you first create the book, you may not have the title yet. I think that would be a common use case. So I'm going to default this to null. So what that means now, or if you remember before, when I default a value, you don't have to pass it in. So I can instantiate book. I have to give the author, but I don't have to give a title. And if I don't give it, the title variable will be null. For chapters, could you have some starting chapters when you first create the book? Could I already have some chapters ready? Yes, absolutely. But you also could not have any chapters yet, right? That would be maybe even more common. So what I like to do in this, when I'm creating an object, and the object is going to have a collection of other objects, one of its properties are going to hold other objects, what I tend to do is to go ahead and default it to an empty set of that collection. So to create an array list, an instance of an array list object that has no values, there is a built-in function that we can use, array list of, and then I have to say again, chapter, and then quotes. So what this does here is it creates a brand new array list that can only hold chapter objects, and in this case, it's empty. So now when I instantiate the book, we can pass in all three parameters if we want, but we really only have to pass in author. So I can come down here now, we don't need this print line anymore. So we can do val book equals book, and to make it read a little easier, I'll do author equals me, Michael Thornton. So if I do this right here, if that's all I do, and I go ahead and run it, everything should run fine, good. There's no output yet. We'll get to output here in a minute. But everything runs fine, and we have a book. So I can now, if I went down and said something like print line book dot author, and then let's do print line book dot title. And now when I run this, we'll see that we get the author and the title is null. But if I went up here, I could certainly have provided one. The greatest story ever told. I have high hopes for this book. And so now we create our book, and you'll see that we have Michael Thornton, the greatest story ever told. Notice I didn't, and this is pretty common here, I didn't pass in a chapters and just let it default to empty. I could have, out in this code, created an array list and populated it and passed it in, but we're going to do it a little different way. So that gives us our 3 properties. And the different way that we're going to do it is we're going to create a add chapter function. And this is very common. A lot of times when I'm creating classes, data classes that contain or hold data. A lot of times in mobile apps, this data ends up getting displayed on the screen in a list. That's super, super common. When you create the underlying object, it wouldn't be unusual for you to have some kind of an add method to it. So let's go through and do that. So let's do fun add chapter. And what do we want to add? Well, we want to add chapter, so let's pass one in. Chapter that is of type chapter. And the code potentially can be very, very simple. We can say chapters, because remember, we've already created a chapters. I'm guaranteed that this object exists, right? It's not optional. Guaranteed that it exists. So in chapters dot append, or no, add, sorry, chapter. And now it will add the chapter to our book. And so that we can see things, I'm going to go ahead and go down here and create our toString function so that we can add some chapters and print them out. So let's do override fun toString returns a string. So I'm going to cover something that I don't think I've talked about yet. When we do toString, remember that it returns a string. It doesn't print things out, it returns a string. And in this case, I'm going to run through all the chapters in the book, and there could be 0 or there could be 1,000, right? So when I create it, I'm going to have to keep adding things to my string. Hopefully that makes sense, and if not, maybe it will here. So let's start with this. Let's go and start with our output. So let's create a val. I'll just call it output. I don't know what else to call it. And that is going to be equal to a string builder. So a string builder is an object. This exists, same concept exists in Java, so you may have seen it before. But a normal string is immutable, right? A normal string, I can't change it. I can create new strings and assign them back to the original variable, but that's not the same thing. String builder actually has the ability to add on to an existing string. So that's what we're going to do here. So we'll create a new string builder, and let's default it to, actually no, we can default it to a good value. So we can say title, because we know we have a title, right? I know, unquestionably, we have a title. So we'll do title colon and then do $ this dot, oh sorry, author. I mean, author's the one we know. So let's start with author. So this dot author, and then at some point down here we're going to do a return output dot to string, because remember, output is a string builder. We need to return a string, so I'm going to convert it to a string. So if I come down here now and I just say print line book, if I didn't make any typos, we should print the author. Oh, yeah, I got some problems here. Okay, I got some code issues here, so let's find out. What have I mistyped? Oh, mistyped chapters. Okay, let's run and see what else. C-H-A-P-T-E-R. C-H-A-P-T-E-R. That doesn't make any sense. Unresolved. That's not true. Oh, I didn't type in, oops. Yeah. I didn't declare it as a property. So it ended up just being a parameter. It didn't get saved anywhere. I need to say that it's a val. Okay, so we're getting closer, and down here I made return, return. Oh, okay, getting closer. Print line book, Java abstract string builder dot append. Okay, it does not like I said, I'll leave this stuff in here just so you can see it. Oh, one thing to notice, I've mentioned before, I think, underpinning Kotlin is Java. The way it compiles stuff, Java's kind of built in, so it uses a lot of things out of Java. And you'll see that's what it did. Okay, so it's complaining, and normally in a real editor, this is so much easier because it highlights everything a lot better. But it looks like somewhere in my toString has a problem. So let's see. Now output string builder. I'm not sure. It's not jumping out at me. Let me think for a second. Oh, here we go. Sorry. So I put my $sign in the wrong place. I make lots of mistakes. right? So this is $sign saying this is a variable, and in this case, the variable is a block of code. And in the block of code, we're going to evaluate this .author. So I think this should solve. There we go, author. Okay, so we've got that much. But what I really want to do is print out everything. So I might say, let's say var t equals this dot. Actually, let's do it this way. We want to do an if statement. Well, no, we can do that. Just trying to think how we want to do the title, right? Well, if the title's null, we want to say it's null, right? So that's fine. So let's do output dot append. So we're going to append data to our string. And let's append what? Title. This dot title. Now, if I just run this right now, we're going to have a problem. See how it all runs together. We need to explicitly put in our, because remember, we're returning a string here, and we're just printing out that one string. So we need to include our line breaks here. So let's go to the end and add line breaks to the end of these guys. There we go. And that should break them out into 2 lines. Perfect. And then maybe to make it look a little prettier, we'll do output dot append. Maybe we'll put some dashes here. And then next we'll add the chapters. So to do the chapters, we'll do chapters dot, I'll do a for each loop, because that's probably the one you've never seen before. And let's do output dot append. And in this case, all I need to append is $it, because what is it? If you remember from the previous lecture, it is, actually not $it, just it. It is the chapter. Right? So this is an array list, right? A list of a whole bunch of chapters. Each time through this loop, it refers to one chapter. And when I call it, or when I append it, it's going to convert it to a string. But I need a carriage return line feed, so let's go ahead and put it in quotes. We'll do $it. It will automatically call to string. I don't need to do it explicitly, although it would not be wrong to do that. It's just up to you. I'm going to do it that way, keep it nice and simple. So now we'll add all the chapters on, and then we'll output it. So let's go down here, and let's test our add chapter. So we have a book. Let's do book dot add chapter, chapter 1. And let's add chapter 2 and chapter 3. So we add 3 chapters, we print, so we're going to expect to see author title and our 3 chapters. Unless I made any more mistakes, and oh, I did not. So there we go. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3. Now, if this was a homework assignment, and this is what you turned in, and you'd say, look, I tested it, and it added the chapters, and it printed them out just like I asked. And I would go through and take a bunch of points off. Well, maybe not a bunch, but certainly a significant number of points off. Because you didn't really, this doesn't really fully test, our code, and specifically add chapter. So there's a problem. What if I added a chapter twice? Right? So right now, so I added the same chapter twice, but it just added it twice, right? Because all we do is we take this object and we just dumbly, right, add it into the list. We don't really care. Or what if, in this case, what if over here I made a mistake somewhere and I called it chapter 2, and this would be a more common bug, that my variable, right, I created chapter 3, but I accidentally put in chapter 2. So now when I run it, it's the chapter 3 data, but the number's wrong, right? So one of the rules that we might have is say that, chapters, you can't add a chapter that already exists, right? That would be a reasonable rule. So how would we do that? So let's go back up to add chapter. What I need to do is search through, when I go to add a chapter, I need to go search through all the chapters we already have and make sure that I don't have a chapter with that same number already. Now you could do it the old-fashioned way, which would be to loop through each one and do a check, do like like we did the for each here. We do chapters for each. If it equals chapter dot, or it dot chapter, what did I call the property? Chapter number. So here, let me just type it out instead of explain. So I could do something like this, if, or no, sorry, chapters dot for each, and then we could say, if it dot chapter number is equal to chapter dot chapter number, right? So in this case now we have a duplicate, so I could just say return, right? So maybe our logic is going to say, if you got a duplicate, just skip it. Don't want you to do anything, right? That could be what we do, right? And that would be fine. That's one way to do it. But that's not how we're going to do it. There's another way. So I want to introduce to you some of the methods that are built into collections. So one of the methods that are built into collection objects, in this case the array list, is a filter. And it's when you first do it, it's slightly mind-bending, but it's really not. So you'll see. So I'm going to create a new thing called val existing chapter, and it's going to be equal to chapters.filter. And then filters. So remember in one of the lectures on functions, I talked about these lambdas, and I said, look, these things show up a lot. You may not start creating your own, but you're going to have to use them and pass them in as parameters all the time. And here's a good case. So chapter.filter takes one parameter, and that parameter is a lambda. And it's a lambda that has no inputs, right? It's a function with no inputs, but one output, a Boolean, true, false. So let me just write the code and then explain what's going on. That'll probably be easier. And maybe that might make it the easiest way to explain it. So when you call filter, it's expecting a lambda, and the lambda function, it's going to give you one parameter, and that parameter is going to be a chapter object, and then it expects you to return a true or false. And in lambdas, the very last line is assumed to be a return statement. So it's just kind of a shortcut. So the way you would typically see this written would be, and I'm going to call it C, just short for chapter, because I've already got the word chapter somewhere and it will start to get confusing. And actually this would be existing chapter, filters, C equals, chapter number, right? Okay. So what's going to happen here, sorry about that, I was trying to think through real quick and make sure I do this right. So what happens is this block will be called one time for each item stored in this chapter's array list. So in this case, I've added 3 chapters. This will then run 3 times. The first time will be pointing to your first chapter, your second chapter, your third chapter. And then this line of code will run for each one of those. And if this returns true, this instance will be added to a new array list called existing chapters. So I'm going to say that again. Hopefully it makes sense. What's going to happen here is what do I want to accomplish, right? My goal is I want to go through and I want to see, is any chapter in my array list have the same number as the one that I'm trying to add? So to do that, I'm going to go through and say, hey, I want to take all the chapters I have and I want to filter them to only see chapters that have the same number as the one that's incoming. C-H-A-P-T, no, that's about right. For some reason it looked weird. And so then this line of code runs. Then what's going to be done is existing chapter will either be an array list with no chapters in it, or it will be an array list with the chapters that have the same number as the one being passed in. So then I could come down here and check and say if existing chapter dot count is greater than 0. And I've got to put my parentheses in. Then I want to add it. Otherwise, I don't. So I'll walk through that again. I know it's a little confusing. Actually, let's run it first and we'll see it work and see if I made any typos anywhere. Oh, no, sorry. If it's equal 0. Sorry about that. Let's run this again. Okay, so notice that I did try to add chapter 3. Chapter 3 was numbered chapter 2. And notice it did not get added. Remember last time we saw all 3. So what happened? We passed in chapter 1. Chapter 1 doesn't exist, so it was added. Chapter 2 didn't exist. When we got down to chapter 3, we went through, we called filter. Filter ran, this block of code ran 2 times. Once for chapter 1, once for chapter 2. When it ran for chapter 2, C was pointing to this data right here, and this chapter number is 2. But this object that got passed in, which was chapter 3, right, it had the same chapter number. So because this equates to true, that a pointer to that instance got added to the existing chapter, which is a brand new array list. Now I went down here and I said, if the array list has if it's equal to nothing, meaning none of the chapters, this was never true, then go ahead and add it. But if we found at least one that had it, then we don't do anything, right? There's no else statement. So now if I run, or so we go down here and we correct the data, change it to 3, and now we'll add all 3. So again, a little confusing, but you'll have a copy of the code, and you'll get your opportunity to do some very, very, very similar code to this on your homework assignment. But this pattern, or similar, very, very similar patterns to this come up a lot, where you add something, but you need to check to see, there's some rules that need to be followed before you put it in, and duplicate checks are pretty common. This is, one really nice way of doing a duplicate check. Okay, so we've got that. So get chapter. So maybe we also want to, somehow we want to pull out and get the chapter object out of the array list. So we can do that. So let's do fun get chapter. And so what chapter do we want to get? We got to say what kind, right? And so again, we've kind of said that our chapter numbers are unique. So let's get it by chapter number. So get chapter number, and remember chapter number is an int, and it returns what? Chapter. However, you could ask for a chapter number that didn't exist, in which case we're going to have to return a null. So we're going to return an optional chapter, because maybe we won't find one, right? Make sense? And what we can do here is we can do almost exactly what we did up here. In fact, I can just go grab this code. And I can say existing chapter equals chapters.filter, right? And now, in this case, it would just be chapter number, right? Because that's the parameter we passed in. So we go through and we grab the chapter number. And if it exists, we want to return the chapter. Otherwise, we want to return null. So this time, what I think I'm going to do is do it a little bit different than what we did before. So last time we checked to see if it was equal to 0. So this time, let's say if existing chapter dot count is greater than 0. Now, you and I both know, because of the way we've written the code here, existing chapter is either going to have 1 chapter or 0, right? You couldn't have 2 chapters with the same number. But I don't really have any good way of defining that, right? I mean, you could say existing chapter.count is equal to 1. We could do it this way. However, what I found is that, yes, in the code, we should never ever see more than 1, because I know the logic here, but bugs happen, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and just play it safe and just say, if we have more than 1, right, we're going to return something. So in this case, what am I going to return? Well, I'm going to return existing chapter dot first. And this is going to seem a little weird, but let's go ahead and finish this out first. Else, what do we return? Return null. So the reason I do it this way, like I say, this should either have 0, which we return null, or it should have exactly 1. But maybe somehow there was a bug somewhere, or somebody instantiated it here. Like you could pass in chapters when you first created it, and we don't have any logic there. So you could pass in 6 copies of chapter 1. So because of that, maybe we could get more than one chapter. So you got to figure out, well, if I found more than one, if I found more than one, what do we return? Well, what I'm going to do is go here and say, just give them the first one. Now, there should only be one, but just in case there's more than one, just give them the first one. And like I say, these patterns you'll see pretty common. It's really just kind of thinking about what are the kind of the weird cases that could happen, and how do I write some defensive code that would intelligently account for some strange occurrences. So now if I come down here, I can say val c equals book.get chapter. Let's get chapter 2. Print line C. And so now we would expect return. Where did I miss? Huh, surprises me it did that. Did I miss something? Oh, return. There we go. Forgot to type return. There we go. So now we'll see that we got our chapter 2. Okay, so how long is this video? Okay, well, you know what? We're already on 30 minutes. I'm going to stop here. There's really not much else. I have to think about it, but I think that's all I wanted to cover on classes. So this is probably the last lecture. But if I think of anything else, I'll create another video. So, stopping here.